She lived a very quiet life in a small home where every day felt almost the same. The mornings were simple, the evenings were calm, and the world around her never seemed to notice her much. She was the kind of person who did not speak loudly, did not demand attention, and often stayed in the background. People around her saw her as ordinary, someone who would not stand out in any crowd. But what they did not know was that inside her, there was a deep world filled with sound, rhythm, and emotion that she never showed openly. From a very young age, she was drawn to music. It was not something she was forced into or something she studied in a formal way. It was something she felt. When she heard melodies, even simple ones, she would stop for a moment and listen carefully, as if trying to understand every hidden detail inside the sound. She did not have a perfect piano at home, but she often imagined one. Sometimes she would tap soft rhythms on wooden tables or old surfaces, just to feel the flow of music through her fingers. It was her way of escaping the silence that surrounded her daily life. Her family did not discourage her, but they also did not fully understand her passion. To them, music was just something nice to hear, not something to build a future on. They believed life needed practical skills, steady work, and safe choices. So, she was often advised to focus on simple goals, things that would not lead to disappointment. She listened quietly, nodding without argument, but inside she never stopped feeling the pull of music. As time passed, she slowly found small ways to stay connected to her passion. Whenever she got the chance, she would sit near a piano, even if she could not play it freely. Sometimes it was at a community center, sometimes at a relative's home, and sometimes at places where the instrument was just sitting unused. She would gently press the keys, learning by feeling rather than being taught. Each note she discovered felt like a small victory, something personal and meaningful. What made her different was not just her interest in music, but the way she understood it. She did not see piano keys as just black and white buttons. To her, each key had a feeling, a voice, a mood. Some sounded like calm rain, some like distant memories, and some like emotions she could not even explain. She did not have the language to describe it properly, but she carried those feelings inside her every time she practiced. Even though she loved music deeply, she rarely shared this part of herself with others. She was shy when it came to showing her talent. She feared being judged or laughed at. In her world, it felt safer to stay quiet and unnoticed. So, she kept her practice private, almost like a secret. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to fully express what she felt inside. There were moments when she doubted herself. She would think about whether her passion was just a dream without meaning. She saw others around her following clear paths in life, while she was still exploring something uncertain. At times, she wondered if she should stop and choose a more stable direction. But every time she sat near a piano or heard a melody, that doubt would fade away, replaced by something stronger that pulled her back. One ordinary day, something small happened that would slowly lead to a change in her life. She heard about a gathering where people would come together for a simple event. It was not anything big or glamorous. It was just a casual moment where someone needed a few minutes of music to fill the atmosphere. At first, she did not think much about it. She assumed others would handle it as usual. But later, she was unexpectedly asked if she could play something. The request was simple and direct. There was no expectation of anything special. In fact, the way it was asked made it clear that they only wanted a very basic tune, something soft in the background. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should agree. Her heart felt a little nervous, not because she could not play, but because she had never played in front of people who expected so little from her. Still, she agreed quietly. She did not want to refuse, and she also did not want to explain herself. She simply nodded and accepted the moment as it was. Inside, however, her thoughts began to move quickly. She started thinking about how she would play, what she would choose, and how people might react. The idea of being watched made her slightly uncomfortable, but she tried to stay calm. As the time approached, she found herself standing near the piano that would be used for the event. It was not a grand instrument. It was simple, slightly old, but still capable of producing beautiful sound. She looked at it carefully, running her fingers lightly over the edge as if trying to connect with it before even playing. The room around her slowly filled with people, voices, and movement, but she focused only on the piano in front of her. Some people noticed her and assumed she was just filling in for a small moment. There was no special attention given to her. A few continued their conversations without even looking in her direction. Others simply waited for the background music to begin so the event could continue smoothly. She could feel that she was not the center of attention, and in a strange way, that made her feel both relieved and slightly anxious at the same time. She took a slow breath and prepared herself. Her hands rested gently above the keys. For a brief moment, everything felt still. The noise of the room seemed distant, almost fading away. It was just her and the piano now. She did not think about proving anything. She did not think about impressing anyone. She simply reminded herself to play the simple tune she was asked for. But deep inside, something was waiting. Something she had carried for years without showing it. Something that had grown quietly every time she practiced alone. She did not know it yet, but this moment was about to reveal more than anyone in that room could expect. The room was slowly filling with people, and the sound of small conversations mixed together like a soft background noise. She stood near the piano, waiting for the right moment to sit down. Her hands felt a little cold, not because the weather was bad, but because she could feel the attention of the room growing without anyone directly looking at her. Even though no one was focused on her yet, she still felt as if every step she would take next mattered. She adjusted her posture slightly and tried to calm her thoughts. She reminded herself again that she was only expected to play something simple. Just a few soft notes. Nothing more. That thought should have made her relaxed, but instead, it made her even more aware of the pressure she had placed on herself. It was not the pressure from others, but from her own mind that had always wanted to do more than she was allowed to show. The piano stood quietly in front of her. It was not new, but it was not broken either. It had a kind of old charm, like it had seen many moments before this one. She placed her fingers lightly on the edge of the keys without pressing them. For a moment, she just felt the surface, as if trying to understand the instrument again, even though she had touched similar ones many times before. Someone nearby gave a small signal that it was time to begin. The room slowly settled as people turned their attention toward the front. She noticed the shift in atmosphere. Conversations became softer. Movements slowed down. Even the air around her felt like it had changed slightly, becoming more focused, more expectant. She gently sat down on the piano bench. The wood felt firm beneath her. She adjusted her position carefully, making sure she was comfortable. She did not want anything physical to distract her once she began. Her eyes looked down at the keys, black and white, arranged in perfect order. To most people, they were just notes, but to her, they were possibilities waiting to be shaped. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a brief moment. She took a slow breath. In that breath, she tried to clear everything from her mind. The people watching, the expectation, the instruction to keep it simple, even her own doubts. She tried to bring herself into a quiet space inside her mind where only the music existed. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, clear, almost fragile in the beginning. The sound spread gently into the room, not demanding attention but quietly inviting it. It was exactly what had been expected from her. Simple, calm, and controlled. The first few seconds stayed that way, and people listened without much reaction, as if confirming that this was just a normal performance. She continued playing the simple tune. Her hands moved carefully, following a pattern she had decided on earlier. She kept her expression calm, not showing too much emotion, but inside, something was slowly starting to shift. The more she played, the more she felt the music connecting not just to her fingers, but to her thoughts and memories. She remembered the quiet times she had spent practicing alone, the moments when no one was watching, the small feelings she had never shared with anyone. Those memories began to mix with the sound she was creating. It was still simple on the surface, but inside her, it was slowly becoming something deeper. A few people in the room continued to talk quietly, not fully paying attention. But others started to notice that the tune had a soft beauty to it. It was not loud or impressive yet, but there was something calming in the way she played. It made some people pause for a moment longer than they expected. She noticed this shift. Even though she tried to stay focused on the simple structure she was supposed to follow, her emotions were starting to influence the rhythm slightly. A note would last a little longer than planned. Pause would feel more meaningful than before. She was still within the boundaries of the simple tune, but it was no longer completely flat or mechanical. Her hands moved a little more confidently. The hesitation she had in the beginning was slowly fading. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing, allowing the music to flow through her without forcing it. This natural flow made the sound more expressive without her fully realizing it. Some heads in the room turned slightly. People who were not paying attention before now began to notice that the music had a different feeling to it. It was still soft, but it was starting to carry emotion. It was the kind of sound that made people stop for a second without knowing why. She remained focused on the keys. Her eyes did not wander. She did not look at the audience. She was not thinking about their reaction yet. All she knew was the feeling under her fingers, the connection between her mind and the instrument. That connection was becoming stronger with each passing second. As she continued, something subtle began to change inside her. The simple tune she had been asked to play was no longer just a task. It was becoming a space where her hidden feelings were slowly finding expression. She was not breaking any rules. She was still playing what she was supposed to. But the way she played it was quietly evolving. A few more people turned their attention fully toward her. Conversations in the background became less noticeable. The room was not completely silent yet, but there was a growing sense that something was different. Something was beginning to form in the music that could not be ignored for long. She felt this change, but she did not stop. Instead, she continued with slightly more confidence. Her fingers moved with a smoother rhythm now. The notes began to flow more naturally. There was a softness mixed with a quiet strength that was not there in the beginning. Her breathing became more steady. The nervousness that she had felt earlier was not gone completely, but it was no longer controlling her. It had shifted into the background, replaced by focus. She was present in the moment in a way she had rarely experienced before. The simple tune was still there, but it was beginning to feel alive. It was no longer just a set of instructions. It was becoming a reflection of her inner world, shaped gently by emotions she had kept hidden for a long time. And without anyone in the room fully realizing it yet, this was only the beginning of something much greater that was about to unfold. She continued to play as the simple tune filled the room, but now something in the atmosphere had started to change. It was not sudden or loud. It was slow, like a small shift in the air that people could not immediately explain. At first, most of the audience still thought it was just a basic performance, something pleasant but not special. Yet there were a few who had already started to sense that there was something more behind the sound. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano keys. Her hands moved with steady control, following the pattern she had begun earlier. But now, her emotions were no longer fully under control. They were quietly blending into the rhythm. Every note she played carried a little more feeling than before. It was still simple on the surface, but underneath it was becoming deeper. A few people near the front leaned slightly forward without realizing it. They were not fully aware of why they were doing it. It was as if the music was gently pulling their attention closer. Conversations in the back of the room had become less noticeable. Some people had stopped talking altogether, even if they had not planned to. She could feel this change, but she did not look up. She did not want to break her focus. Her world at that moment was the piano, the sound, and the feeling that was slowly growing inside her chest. It was a feeling she had carried for a long time but never expressed fully in front of others. The simple tune she was asked to play was still there, but it was no longer limited. She had not changed the structure completely, but she had started to shape it in a way that felt more personal. A gentle variation here, a slightly longer pause there, a softer touch on certain keys. These small changes were enough to make the music feel alive. One person near the side of the room paused mid-step while walking. They had been heading toward the exit or perhaps just moving to another spot, but the sound made them stop. They stood still for a moment, listening more carefully than they had planned to. Then they slowly turned their attention toward the piano. She did not notice these reactions directly, but she could sense the shift in energy. It was like the room was no longer fully divided between those who were listening and those who were not. More and more attention was gathering toward her without any announcement or instruction. Her fingers moved more freely now. The hesitation she had in the beginning had almost disappeared. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply allowing the music to flow through her in a natural way. That freedom made her playing smoother, more connected, and more expressive. The simple tune was beginning to feel like a story, not a loud or dramatic story, but a quiet one filled with emotion. It carried hints of loneliness, hope, patience, and something unspoken that could not be easily described in words. A few more heads turned in her direction. People who had not been paying attention before were now fully focused on her. The change was gradual, but it was clearly happening. The room was slowly shifting from background noise to shared attention. She finally felt a small difference in herself too. It was not confidence in the usual sense. It was something softer, a sense that she was finally expressing something she had held inside for too long. Her fingers were no longer just following instructions. They were speaking in their own quiet language. The notes became slightly more expressive. A gentle rise in rhythm, a deeper touch on lower keys, a lighter movement on higher ones. These details were subtle, but together they created something that felt richer than a simple tune. Someone in the middle of the room stopped looking at their phone. They slowly placed it down and turned their full attention toward the performance. Another person who had been sitting with a tired expression now looked more alert, as if something had awakened their interest. She still did not look at the audience. She was not aware of each individual reaction, but she could feel that the space around her had changed. The silence was not complete, but it was becoming more meaningful. Even the smallest sounds in the room felt quieter than before. Her breathing became steady and natural. She was no longer thinking about whether she was doing it correctly or whether she was meeting expectations. She was simply inside the music, moving with it instead of controlling it too tightly. The simple tune began to carry a gentle emotional rise. It was not dramatic or loud. It was more like a slow unfolding of feelings that had been hidden beneath the surface. Each phrase of music seemed to add another layer to that emotional depth. A few people exchanged quiet looks with each other, as if silently asking whether they were hearing the same thing. There was no need for words. The music itself was answering questions they had not even spoken out loud. She continued without stopping. Her hands moved with increasing smoothness. The earlier nervous energy had almost completely transformed into focus. She was no longer just playing notes. She was shaping an experience. At the back of the room, someone who had been distracted earlier now stood still. They were fully engaged in the sound. The performance had begun to draw in people from all corners of the space, not because it was loud, but because it was emotionally present. The tune remained simple, but the feeling behind it had grown. It was like a plain path that had suddenly become filled with small details that made it beautiful in a quiet way. Nothing was forced. Everything felt natural, as if it had always been meant to be this way. She felt a small sense of surprise within herself. She had not planned to change anything. She had only intended to play what was asked of her. But something inside her had slowly taken over, guiding her fingers in a more expressive direction without breaking the original structure. The room was now mostly quiet, not because someone asked for silence, but because people were choosing to listen. The transformation was subtle, but it was clear. What started as a simple background tune was now something that held attention. She still had no idea how deeply she was affecting those around her. She only knew that the music felt different now. It felt fuller, more meaningful, and more connected to her own emotions. And as she continued to play, without realizing it yet, the moment was quietly moving towards something even more powerful that no one in the room was fully prepared for. The room had grown noticeably quieter, though no one had asked for silence. It was the kind of silence that happens on its own, when people slowly stop doing what they were doing and start paying attention without realizing it. She was still sitting at the piano, her fingers moving gently across the keys, unaware of how much the atmosphere around her had changed. What had started as a simple tune was no longer simple in the way people were experiencing it. The structure of the music was still there, but the feeling behind it had deepened. Each note seemed to carry more weight, more emotion, more presence. It was no longer just background sound. It was becoming something that held the room together. She kept her posture steady, her focus fixed on the piano. Her eyes remained on the keys, and her expression stayed calm. But inside, something stronger was building. It was not nervousness anymore. It was not hesitation. It was a growing flow of emotion that she could no longer separate from the music itself. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. The earlier carefulness had faded into a natural rhythm. She was not forcing anything. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply letting the music guide her. And because of that, the sound became more alive, more expressive, more unpredictable in a gentle way. A few people in the room who had been standing near the back now slowly moved forward without thinking. They were drawn in by something they could not fully explain. It was not loud or dramatic. It was something softer, something that touched attention quietly but deeply. One person who had been looking away earlier now turned completely toward the piano. Their expression changed slightly, as if they were trying to understand when the performance had become so different from what they expected. It was still the same piano, the same performer, the same room, but it no longer felt the same. She continued playing, still unaware of the full impact. Her world had narrowed into sound and movement. The keys under her fingers felt familiar, almost like an extension of her own thoughts. Every motion she made seemed to carry meaning now, even if she did not plan it that way. The simple tune had started to evolve quietly. It was not a sudden change. It was more like layers being added one by one. A slightly stronger note here, a softer pause there, a smooth transition that made the melody feel like it was breathing. People in the room were now fully engaged. Some who had been sitting casually now sat upright. Others leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch every detail. Even those who did not usually pay attention to music found themselves drawn into it without resistance. She felt something shift inside her again. This time it was not just emotion. It was awareness. A quiet realization that the music she was creating was no longer small. It was growing beyond what she had originally intended. But instead of stopping, she continued. Her hands moved more freely now. There was a smooth connection between thought and action. She did not have to think about each note before playing it. The music was flowing through her in a continuous stream. It felt natural, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. A soft change in rhythm began to appear. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But then it became clearer. The tune was no longer repeating in a simple pattern. It was expanding, gently rising and falling like waves that carried emotion instead of water. The room responded to this without words. People were not speaking, not moving unnecessarily. Even small sounds like shifting in chairs or adjusting posture became rare. The attention was fully centered on her now. She still did not look up. Her focus remained on the piano, but her awareness of the space around her had sharpened. She could feel the presence of the audience more strongly now, not as pressure, but as silent attention. The music grew richer. It was still based on the simple tune she had been asked to play, but she was stretching it gently, adding emotional depth through timing and touch. A note held slightly longer than expected created a feeling of reflection. A quicker sequence added a sense of movement and life. Someone near the side of the room quietly placed their hand over their chest, not because anything was physically wrong, but because the music had touched something deeper than they expected. Another person closed their eyes briefly, as if trying to hold onto the sound more clearly. She felt more connected to the piano than ever before. It was no longer just an instrument in front of her. It felt like a partner in expression. The sound that came out was not separate from her anymore. It was part of her thought process, part of her emotional state, part of her being in that moment. The simple tune had now transformed into something more layered. It was still recognizable, but it carried depth that could not be ignored. It was no longer just pleasant. It was moving. A few people exchanged silent glances again. There was no need for words. They all understood, in their own way, that something unusual was happening. Not unusual in a disruptive sense, but in a rare and unexpected sense of beauty. She continued without interruption. Her confidence had grown, but it was a quiet confidence. Not one that demanded attention, but one that existed naturally in the way she played. Her movements were steady, controlled, and fluid. The melody now had a stronger emotional presence. It felt like it was telling something without using language. It spoke through rhythm, timing, and softness. It created an atmosphere that held people gently in place. Even those who had been distracted earlier were now fully focused. No one seemed in a hurry to leave or move away. Time itself felt slightly slower in the room, as if the music had changed the way it was being experienced. She felt a quiet intensity building inside her, but it was not overwhelming. It was balanced by control. She was aware of every note, but she was not overthinking them. Everything was flowing naturally. The performance was no longer just something she was doing. It was something she was experiencing at the same time as everyone else. She was both inside the music and aware of its effect. As the tune continued to grow in emotional strength, the room remained completely absorbed. No one wanted to break the moment. Even small movements became rare. The attention was complete. She did not know yet how far this moment would go. She only knew that something inside her had awakened through the music, and it was still unfolding quietly, one note at a time. The room had now fallen into a deep kind of silence that felt different from before. It was not an awkward silence or an empty one. It was full, almost heavy with attention. Every small movement, every soft breath, every tiny sound seemed to disappear the moment it was made. She was still sitting at the piano, fully absorbed in the music, unaware of just how deeply the moment had taken over everyone around her. The simple tune she had started with had grown into something far more powerful. It was still built on the same foundation, but now it carried layers of emotion that seemed to rise and fall naturally. It felt like the music had found its own life, guided by her hands but no longer limited by the original request. She kept playing without hesitation. Her fingers moved with a calm confidence that had not been there at the beginning. There was no fear in her expression anymore, no uncertainty in her movements. Everything felt steady, even as the music became more intense. She was no longer thinking about who was watching. She was simply inside the sound. The audience, on the other hand, was completely drawn in. Many of them had stopped adjusting their posture or looking around. Their focus was locked on the piano. It was as if something invisible had connected everyone in the room to the same experience. No one wanted to break that connection. A gentle rise in the melody began to take shape. It was not sudden or loud, but gradual and emotional. The notes became slightly more complex, weaving in and out of each other in a way that felt natural and expressive. It was like watching a calm river slowly turn into a flowing stream, still controlled but full of life. She felt it too. There was a strong sense of flow inside her now. It was not something she was forcing. It was happening on its own, as if her emotions had finally found a clear path through the music. Every thought she had ever held back seemed to be finding a voice through the piano. The room responded again, this time more clearly. A few people could no longer hold back their reaction. Their eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in realization. They were beginning to understand that what they were hearing was far beyond what they had expected from a simple performance. Someone near the side leaned forward, resting their hands together, completely focused. Another person who had been standing at the back slowly moved closer without even noticing it. It was not a conscious decision. The music was guiding attention naturally. She continued, her posture steady, her breathing calm. The piano felt like a part of her now. There was no separation between intention and sound. What she felt inside her chest was directly reflected in the notes she played. The connection was so strong that everything else seemed distant. The melody began to rise again, this time with more emotional strength. It was still controlled, but it carried a deeper intensity. Some notes were held slightly longer, creating moments that felt suspended in time. Others moved quickly, adding contrast and energy. Together, They formed something that felt like a conversation without words. The audience was now fully silent. Even those who had not been paying attention at the beginning were completely engaged. There was no distraction left in the room. No movement felt unnecessary. Everything had slowed down in a way that made the moment feel important. She could feel that energy clearly now. It was not pressure, but presence. It was as if the room itself had become part of the performance. The silence around her was not empty. It was supporting the music, holding it in place, allowing it to grow. Her fingers moved with even more freedom. She was no longer thinking about structure. The original simple tune was still there, but it had transformed into something emotional and layered. It was like a memory being retold in different tones, each version revealing something new. A quiet shift happened in the rhythm. It became slightly more dynamic, more expressive. The changes were subtle, but they made a huge difference in how the music felt. It was no longer predictable. It was alive, breathing with emotion. A few people closed their eyes briefly, not to ignore the performance but to feel it more deeply. Others stared at the piano with complete focus, as if trying to understand how something so simple had turned into something so powerful. She remained completely immersed. There was no thought of time anymore, no awareness of how long she had been playing. There was only the music, flowing through her like a steady stream that could not be stopped. The emotional peak of the performance began to build slowly. It was not sudden or loud. It grew gradually, like a wave forming far in the distance before reaching the shore. The notes became richer, more expressive, carrying a sense of depth that was impossible to ignore. The audience could feel it too. There was a shared sense that something important was happening. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet and powerful emotional way that touched everyone differently. She pressed into the keys with slightly more strength, not forcefully, but with intention. The sound that came out was fuller, deeper, and more resonant. It filled the room in a way that made everything else feel distant. The melody reached a point where it felt like it was telling a story of struggle and release, of silence turning into expression, of something hidden finally being shared. It was not planned, but it was felt. A few people placed their hands together in front of them without even realizing it, holding still as if they were afraid to miss even a single note. The atmosphere had become completely focused on her performance. She felt something rise within her again. It was not stress. It was emotion. A deep, powerful feeling that had been inside her for a long time without expression. It was now flowing freely through the piano. The music swelled gently, reaching its most intense point so far. It was not loud in a harsh way. It was full in a meaningful way. Every note carried weight. Every pause carried feeling. The room seemed to hold its breath together. There was no sound except the piano. No distraction. No interruption. Only music and emotion filling the space. She did not know how others were reacting in detail. She did not need to. She could feel the unity in the silence. She could feel that everyone was with her in that moment, connected through sound. As the emotional peak continued, the performance became something more than just music. It became an experience shared by everyone in the room. Something they would remember without needing to explain it. And still, she continued playing, unaware that the most powerful moment was still building quietly, just ahead, waiting to unfold. The music had reached a point where it felt like the entire room was no longer just a space with people inside it. It had become something else, something shared and connected through sound. She was still sitting at the piano, completely focused, her fingers moving with steady emotion. The performance had grown into something powerful without her trying to force it. It was no longer just a simple tune, and it was no longer just a performance. It had become a moment. As she continued playing, the emotional peak slowly began to shift. It was not an abrupt change. It was gradual, like a wave that had reached its highest point and was now beginning to settle. The intensity in the music remained, but it started to carry a softer feeling, like a deep breath after holding it for a long time. She could feel it in her hands first. The movement of her fingers became slightly gentler. The notes were still clear, still meaningful, but they were beginning to release rather than build. It felt like the music was gently guiding her toward closure, even though she had not planned any specific ending. The audience remained completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the smallest distractions had disappeared. It was as if everyone understood, without being told, that this moment should not be interrupted. The air felt still, almost sacred in its quietness. She was not thinking about the audience anymore. Her focus was entirely within the music. But she was aware, in a distant way, that something special had happened. The feeling inside her was calm but full. It was not excitement anymore. It was a sense of completion forming slowly. The melody began to soften further. The powerful emotional rise from earlier was now turning into something reflective. Each note felt like a memory, slowly fading but still present. It was as if the music was looking back at everything it had expressed and gently letting it go. A few people in the room had tears in their eyes, though they did not try to hide it. Others sat completely still, as if even the smallest movement might break the moment. The connection between performer and audience had become unspoken but very real. She continued to play with care and control. Her hands were steady, but her touch was lighter now. The intensity had transformed into tenderness. The same piano that had carried powerful emotion was now producing something soft and peaceful. The room felt like it was holding its breath again, but this time in a different way. Earlier it had been anticipation. Now it was reflection. People were absorbing what they had just experienced, even though the performance had not fully ended yet. She felt the ending approaching naturally. It was not something she decided. It was something she sensed through the flow of the music. The notes were guiding her toward a final resolution, like a path slowly narrowing toward its destination. Her fingers moved with careful precision. Each note mattered. There was no rush, no pressure, only flow. The simple tune she had started with was still present in spirit, but now it had evolved into something deeply emotional and complete. A gentle pause appeared between phrases. It was not silence, but space. Space that made the music feel even more meaningful. The audience did not react during these pauses. They stayed still, as if waiting for something they did not want to end. She felt a quiet understanding within herself. This moment was coming to an end, but it was not an ending of loss. It was an ending of expression. Everything she had carried inside had been released through sound. The final section of the music began to form naturally. It was softer, slower, and more delicate. The intensity had fully transformed into calmness. The piano no longer felt like it was speaking loudly. It was whispering now. The last few phrases were simple but filled with meaning. Each note felt like it was gently placing the final pieces of a story in place. There was no rush to finish. There was only acceptance of the ending. The audience remained completely engaged. No one looked away. No one shifted their attention. It was as if everyone understood that the final moment mattered just as much as everything before it. She pressed the final set of keys with care. The sound was soft, clear, and lasting. It echoed slightly in the room, not loudly, but enough to be felt deeply. Then she slowly lifted her hands from the piano. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Only silence. It was a complete silence, the kind that feels heavy and full at the same time. No one reacted immediately. It was as if the entire room was still inside the music, unable to step out of it right away. She stayed seated, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her breathing was calm. She did not look at anyone. She was still inside the feeling of what had just happened, as if she needed a moment to return to reality. Then, slowly, something changed in the room. A single clap broke the silence. Then another. And then suddenly, the entire room came alive. The applause grew stronger and fuller, filling the space completely. It was not just polite clapping. It was deep appreciation, surprise, and emotion coming out all at once. People stood up without thinking. Some clapped with smiles, others with visible emotion, and some simply stayed where they were, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. She finally looked up. For the first time, she saw the audience clearly. Their expressions were not casual or indifferent. They were moved. Many were still clapping. Some were nodding slightly, as if they could not find the right words to express what they felt. She did not expect this reaction. She had only intended to play a simple tune. But what had happened was far beyond that simple instruction. Something inside her had taken that small beginning and turned it into something much larger. The applause continued for a while. It was steady and strong. It did not feel like it would end quickly. It was the kind of reaction that comes from genuine surprise and deep appreciation. She slowly stood up from the piano bench. Her movements were careful, almost unsure, as if she was still processing everything. She gave a small, quiet acknowledgement, not dramatic, just sincere. People continued to clap even as she stepped slightly back from the piano. Some still looked at her with disbelief, as if trying to understand how someone they had not expected much from had delivered something so powerful. In that moment, she was no longer just someone who had been asked to play a simple tune. She was someone who had changed the feeling of an entire room through music. As the applause slowly began to settle, she stood there quietly, still feeling the echoes of the performance inside her. It was over, but it was not forgotten. It had become a memory for everyone present, one that would stay long after the sound had faded.